All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Planetary Pause series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today we are honored to host the best-selling author and outstanding visionary, Kim Stanley Robinson. Robinson is an American novelist, widely recognized as one of the foremost living writers of science fiction. His work has been described as humanist science fiction and literary science fiction. He has published 22 novels that have been translated into 24 languages. And his books include the Mars trilogy, New York 2140, Aurora, and the Ministry of the Future for the Future, which we will discuss today. Many of his novels and stories have ecological, cultural, and political themes and feature scientists as heroes. What a concept. Robinson has won numerous awards, including the Hugo and Nebula Awards for Best Novel, World Fantasy Award, and the Arthur C. Clarke Award, to name just a few. The Atlantic has labeled his work the gold standard of realistic and literary science fiction writing. So in addition to mountain climbing and a deep reverence for nature, Robinson holds a PhD in English literature from UC San Diego and has taught at UC Davis. And one last quote from New York Times columnist Ezra Klein. He said, "If I could get policymakers and citizens everywhere to read just one book this year, it would be Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future." And I'm going to highly recommend that all of you who haven't read it run out and buy a copy as soon as we're finished with this program today. So thank you, everyone, and welcome, Stan, and thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Georgia. It's good to be with you.
Well, I'm going to start with just a little background and then a couple of questions. The Ministry for the Future is a profound vision for how we could mitigate the climate crisis, but it also details everything we are up against economically, politically, culturally, and the climate disasters that we are already in the midst of experiencing. You give real life examples and models that could change the course of history if only we are imaginative enough to learn from them. So I want to start out with a question with quote, and then a question related to it. "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism," you say in the book. So my questions are, our deficit of imagination seems to contain a fatalistic quality that causes us to stay on a default course of history that we are to some extent sleepwalking through. So how does this lack of imagination, in your view, reflect on our inability to imagine and manifest alternatives to capitalism or solutions to the climate crisis?
Well, it's funny that you bring up that quote, because that is not my phrase. It comes from my teacher, Frederick Jameson, and Jameson often attributes it to Slavoj Žižek, the Slovenian philosopher. And the two of them bounce that one back and forth, like, no, you said it, no, you said it. So it's a kind of a joke, and Žižek is a real joker, so it's hard to know where that phrase came from. But I also think it's not quite right. We can imagine an end to capitalism. This is what utopian literature is always doing, and political economy to the extent it exists. But the problem is that we are clearly, truly, massively entrenched in a global capitalist system. And what we're not very good at imagining that, because it doesn't seem very likely, is how to get from here to there, to any better system. So you could say, well, look, everybody has, everybody gets a minimum of US $100,000 a year. The maximum is $1 million a year, and that you exist in a 1 to 10 wage ratio. And then there's a social safety net that's birth to grave and free healthcare, and we concentrate on peace. We don't use weapons. We don't make weapons. All that money and effort goes into healthcare and other taking care of the biosphere. This is easy stuff to imagine. It's a default situation that strikes a lot of us as obvious as can be. So that's not what we can't imagine. It's getting from the year 2022 and the moment that we're in right now to anything even resembling that at all. So, well, this is one thing science fiction can do. It's got far future, which is spaceships zipping around the galaxy millions of years from now. It's a somewhat of a form of fantasy when you go out a million years. You got day after tomorrow science fiction, which is a kind of a realism. And then you've got that zone in between, which is much less populated by actual texts or movies, about 100 years out, 200 years out. That's what I've been trying to do in my career quite often. And indeed, one of the things I think happened that made Ministry for the Future a standout, a kind of breakout book for me, was instead of putting this stuff 100 years out, I put it in the next 30 years and showed change happening. So that's, I think, the thing that has made Ministry for the Future different is it's precisely trying to hit that gap of imagining the end of capitalism. And it wouldn't be an end either. This is the thing. It's a transformative process, a stepwise process. So that's what I think is going on with this situation.
And maybe partially would be looking at hopefully looking at the end of corporate capitalism that kind of runs governments. But I wanted to get into another thing you mentioned, which seems to be a problem in our culture, and you noted in your book, is what you call the Guter-Dameron syndrome, which you describe as a narcissistic rage. And you note it's more common in men than women, and that these are people who feel entitled and privileged. And what do you think the cause of this bubbling up of this narcissistic rage is on one side, because Trump was just a symptom of it, and what we might be able to do to try to mitigate some of that rage if it's possible. And the other part of that narcissism, which I think is important to our group, is what you call the narcissism of small differences, where it's hard to accomplish anything because everybody wants their vision to be the one that's chosen, and how we get past that attachment to our own vision.
Well, this is hard stuff, and that's one small chapter in Ministry for the Future that is an attempt to throw out ideas that might explain why prosperous people are so opposed to the idea that there might be more justice and equality in the world, when it probably isn't going to ding them, but a sense of entitlement, a sense of fear that if you lose anything, you might lose everything.
Mm-hmm.
But group psychology, in the technical sense of using psychological terms, is only of limited value. I think this is just one chapter of a book that's more concerned with political economy and with mass action without trying to psychologize it. I do think it is an American thing that if we have to go down and not be the superpower anymore, or if my privileges are to go away in a kind of white privilege sense, that I'm going to bring the whole system down with me, which is a narcissistic response. But again, I personally am wary of this psychologizing of groups. It's a little too easy. It does explain, I think, the backstabbing on the left, that the narcissism of small differences is a very important phrase of Freud's, that you're more concerned to argue with the people that you're in the same discourse space with than you are with the shared enemies that are much more inimical to your interests. And that's a mistake. So best to avoid those kinds of mistakes.
Right, and a lot of us have run into it many, many times.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes, especially politically active people. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about something that I think none of us really think about that much, is what you noted in your book is called the wet bulb temperature, and what temperature and levels of humidity that human life could not be sustained, and what that means, what it looks like, and how close are we to that kind of problem.
Well, it was the origin for this book. I read about the wet bulb 35 temperature danger about 5 years ago, maybe 2017. And I thought, I have to write about this, because there was an argument going around that climate change could simply be adapted to, that humans were so adaptable. And this is kind of eco-futurists, green technologist, a kind of Silicon Valley view that we'll just tech our way out of anything, and humans are so adaptable, and also economists, including William Nordhaus, who won the pseudo Nobel for economics for suggesting that we can set a high discount rate, let the future solve their own problems, and that you could go up to a 3.5 C rise in global temperatures, and that humans would simply adapt to that. We'd just pay for it, pay our way out of all these problems. And now the scientific community had these facts, but they put them together in a new way that rang alarm bells that spread through the culture in 2017. I believe we knew this stuff before, but the wet bulb 35 temperature is a heat index. It combines heat and humidity, and it's the combination of heat and humidity that is fatal to humans. At that combination, you can't cool down. You would have to be in an air-conditioned space. You could be naked in the shade indoors with a fan on you and still die of hyperthermia because the fanning wouldn't work. Now, we've had wet bulb 35 temperatures in the Persian Gulf. They only lasted for an hour or so. And we've had wet bulb 34 temperatures right outside Chicago in 1995. So the implication there is profound, that a huge swath of the Earth's surface where billions of people live, literally a half of the world's population, are in areas that could have these kind of temperatures hit. And so we have to get really serious about decarbonization. And so we have to really think about geoengineering as an emergency measure, because we are so close to getting into these deadly zones already. When I comprehended all this, and I was so irritated anyway with the eco-modernists saying, well, we'll just adapt, because that would imply a mass extinction event with humans in some kind of an air-conditioned fortress mansion all over Earth and ignoring the rest of the species. I was already so irritated with them that I thought, this collapses their argument like a house of cards, and it has to be emphasized. And so you see the first chapter of Ministry for the Future.
Yes, as you can see in that, yeah, which is very important. I wanted to go now to something that you talked about in the book about developing a carbon currency, or and blockchain banking, an open source type of banking where all transactions are transparent. That's connected to it, an open source ledger, you called it. But let's go first to carbon pricing and what a carbon currency. We actually have a picture of a carbon currency that John will put in the chat box right now, an artist's attempt at creating a carbon currency. So I don't know where you want to dive in with that.
Well, let me, this is important to distinguish these two. The two parts of your question are different, so I'm going to take them one at a time. First, the good, the carbon coin. It's gaining traction. The central banks are talking about it. The idea would be that new quantitative easing would be based on a kind of carbon standard. You draw down a ton of carbon, you get a carbon coin, it's tradable on the currency exchanges, and will be worth more than the amount of money that you paid to draw that carbon down, and the backing for that currency, so that it didn't deflate below the amount of money that you would need to draw the carbon down, would be the central banks themselves issuing fiat currency, but only on that standard. So now they're even talking about this being not so much a matter of carbon quantitative easing, but in the overall picture of things, it might even form a kind of quantitative tightening, which the central banks are now desperate for, because there's too much money out there and it's all gone to the rich. So the carbon coin, you can go to the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a consortium of 89 of the biggest central banks, all the ones you'd want there. And they are discussing the greening of finance, of money itself. It's great stuff. And it's all new to me. When I wrote Ministry for the Future, I was not aware of this Network for Greening the Financial System. Super encouraging. On the other hand, I wish I had not mentioned the word blockchain in my novel. It's too associated with Bitcoin and with cryptocurrencies, both of which I don't believe in, particularly Bitcoin, which is a carbon disaster. And the proof of work needed to make a Bitcoin is unnecessary for ordinary cryptography. It's a specialized procedure that necessarily burns energy, and you can claim, oh, but that's clean energy if it is, but that clean energy could go to more useful things than just a speculative bubble. I quite hate Bitcoin, and other cryptocurrencies are unproven in their usefulness, because money is the three things. It's medium of exchange, it's a storage of value, and it's a sign of social trust. And it's on all three of those bases, cryptocurrencies fail. So they are tulips, like in the 17th century in Holland. They are a speculative bubble, and everybody who's buying them is thinking, I'll cash out into US dollars before the bubble pops. Everybody thinks they can outthink the markets. And the idea of a bubble is that it pops, that even the smartest dealers are caught unawares and can't get out in time when the popping of a bubble happens. So what I would like to say that I was trying to suggest in ministry was that fiat money could be digitalized money, and could be coded in different ways such that when the banks issued it as fiat currency, they could track it in an international system of savings and exchanges that would kill tax havens, that could be cut down on illegal exchanges, and essentially we could have transparency without blockchain. And it's not really distributed. It would be a state system. It would be fiat money. It would be the central banks. So I essentially, I think I blew it. And that's not the only place I blew it in Ministry for the Future in terms of detailing. But that's certainly one chapter that I would take back and rewrite to try to make it clearer in that regard.
Okay, that's very interesting. I hadn't heard about the green network either in banking. So that's a whole new idea. I wanted to go to, well, there are a few areas we could go from right now, but one of them that I think is really important is to look at the models that you brought out in the book as places that we could learn from and hopefully emulate. And these are the four, there are four of them that you mentioned. One was the business, which I would include values with that as the Mondragon cooperatives in Spain. And one is governance, which you mentioned would be Kerala, India, agriculture, Sikkim, India, and IT, you said Bangalore. So I'd like to kind of take each of those and ask you what it is that has impressed you about these places. So let's start with Mondragon. And then we'll go.
Mondragon is as you know, it's a nested co-op of co-ops that includes the financial system. And so these cooperatives are employee owned and they do not have shareholders. They're the profits for the year, they run businesses that interact with the larger capitalist economy, but then when they make a profit, they share it, as I understand it, as it's being explained to me, into thirds. A third to the employees, a third to capital improvements, and a third to charities that the employees choose. So this is an alternative. In my chapter in ministry, you can see what I said about it. It might be that it is Catholic capitalism. It might be that it's liberation theology translated into an economic system that is capitalism, but done with a value system that comes from the co-op movement. And even the Wikipedia article on cooperatives has a listing of the values of co-ops, and they are not capitalist values.
Right.
And it's interesting as a stepwise, if we talk about post-capitalism, this is a clear step. If the whole world ran on that model, many things would be spectacularly and fundamentally different. So, when you're a science fiction writer trying to imagine what a post-capitalist world would be like 200 years from now, you go to current economists, you go to current political economy, you are in bad trouble to find models. I've been doing this since 1990 and not finding anything much except for Mondragon. So I've used them often. And the other examples are all from India, and that was really an Indian strand in the novel that I'm very happy to have there. But that was India specific in terms of its suggestions for the rest of the world. I think each country, each region can come up with its own versions of this stuff. Regenerative agriculture, and this is what Sikkim is doing, but it's being done all over. It's a movement. Permaculture was theorized in Australia first, and that's at least 40 years old. So regenerative agriculture, and then governance. Well, Kerala has an amazing power sharing agreement between the Congress party and a party even further to the left, and they keep on a regular scheduled basis have agreed to share bounce party power back and forth between these parties, and then it goes right down to the smallest panchayats. And so this is a suggestion for representative democracy that works there. Every region has got its own visions of how we get good political representation. And so I'm not suggesting we need Kerala everywhere. It's just that in that Indian chapter, I was emphasizing that. Same for Bangalore. I mean, really, Bangalore is just like it's the Silicon Valley of India. It may not have nothing, and it has something like 30 engineering universities in one town. I don't know how that works, and I don't know much about Bangalore. So that was just a suggestion that India can be cutting edge. And I want to, before we go on to the next question, back to this stuff about blockchain and finance, because I just am understanding this now. I want to share it with you. Private capital, there's a lot of it. And the big quantitative easings of 2008 and 2020, but because of the way we're structured as kind of monopoly and unregulated free market capitalism, the huge trenches of money that got created to keep the economy liquid in the great quantitative easings of 2008 and 2020 mostly went to the rich and mostly went to big money. And there are what I called in my New York novel, and what we used to call in the 2008 crisis, hedge fund managers. Well, a hedge fund is what rich people invest in to get more than the ordinary standard rate of return. So the alpha is the difference between that year's ordinary standard rate of return and what this hedge fund was to get you. And you would have some hotshots, and it was all Wall Street at its most financialized and speculative, a bunch of gamblers. And you would be, when you're rich enough, you can risk a few tens of millions with a guy that's going to be taking risks with them, might lose it all, but might gain a lot, might get 20% for a year rather than 4% for a year. Well, that's all lame. But now they're talking about asset managers. And I believe they're the same kind of people, doing the same function, but they're doing it for assets that are sometimes pension funds, sometimes government assets, some huge collections of ordinary people's monies, like pension funds or health insurance plans, et cetera, being invested. And what's happening now is that there is a green asset management drive. Just a couple of days ago, a gigantic asset management fund offered to buy the biggest coal company in Australia for 20% more than it was valued. And this was what you might call in the old days a hostile takeover. That coal company wasn't for sale, but 20% more than it's worth, its shareholders might say, take the deal. And that asset management fund was going to close down coal in that coal company in Australia. This is green asset management. And as Mark Carney's been showing, the guy who was Chancellor of the Exchequer, he's a kind of a rallying figure, not quite Mary Murphy from my novel, but nevertheless of huge interest. He knows what he's doing, and he's gotten, as he said at COP26, famously, the $130 trillion in assets where all those companies have promised to go green. And this is a big new force in the world that Ministry for the Future does not adequately represent.
Yeah, a new book started.
No, no,
No, don't tell you that.
Spare me. No.
Okay, I'll spare you that for a year. It's interesting that you mentioned about economists, because when I first was trying to get a contact at Mondragon, several years ago now, I called economists I knew, because I figured, well, they would know somebody there. Not one of them knew any. Not only did they not know anyone at Mondragon, they didn't know what Mondragon was.
Yes, that's
so
right.
They're really a little behind sometimes.
Yes, absolutely.
Major economic alternatives. And the last question I want to ask you before we go to the audience would be about the Ministry for the Future. You talk about that in the novel quite a bit. It's connected to the UN, which I can't imagine that could be the case here. But what would the Ministry of the Future look like to you? How could that operate? And how could it operate globally so that we actually accomplish something globally?
Well, I want to suggest that the UN is also the IPCC, and the UN is also the Paris Agreement, therefore, and the COP meetings. These are all aspects of the UN trying to deal with existential risk and existential dangers like climate change. And although the UN is peculiarly structured because of the Security Council, the Paris Agreement and the COP system is like the General Assembly without a Security Council there. So things are happening to try to adapt the UN to modern needs. And I just want to say that although it has been weakened hugely by the veto power of all Security Council members through the years, it's better than nothing. And it's a way to get together to talk. So I don't think you can disparage the UN. I don't see any other place a Ministry for the Future can come from or be based, except for this. Every organization that is thinking about the future and the long time horizon, and every organization that is out to defend the humans of the future, including children now, and animals and plants and biomes in court, they are already ministries for the future. So it's a name for a viewpoint. And as for a real one, I think this is notional. What I've realized since my book was published, which was in October of 2020, is that many people in this earth think they're already in a ministry for the future and are working hard for it. And that's why they like that book. And I met a real minister for the future, Jane Davidson. She's from Wales. And when she was in the government of Wales, because it's semi-devolved from London, they were able to establish a ministry for the future. But there's a serious problem, is that anytime, and it's similar to having a Department of Science in the United States cabinet, whenever you have a ministry for the future, its purview, its powers should overwhelm every other department in government. And at that point, people's hackles rise. Turf battles. This is my turf. You don't get to tell me what to do just because you're the ministry for the future. So there needs to be, I mean, now Oxford University, one of the colleges at Oxford is working up a ministry for the future that I'm associated with. They take the name from the book. They're trying to figure out what it would mean. And they're immediately, being in England, they're thinking of shadow cabinets that you have, like the UK always has, the party that's out of power has appointed people who would be in the appointments if their party was in power. These shadow cabinets are interesting and suggestive, and a ministry for the future might function on the basis. It's being worked out in some detail as to what one would really be. But I think as a function of the Paris Agreement, because the Paris Agreement does allow for permanent subcommittees, that it's not a bad place to place one at a high level. And we are going to have to make some financial accommodations with the petrostates. This is another thing that I only barely suggest in ministry that's become huge in my mind. And you can see it happening in Russia and Ukraine right now. The petrostates, of which Russia is the biggest and most dangerous, they get 60 to 80% of their governmental incomes from the selling of fossil fuels, because 3/4 of the fossil fuels on this planet are owned by governments, not by Exxon and Royal Dutch Shell. Those private companies are almost irrelevant because it's the government of Brazil, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Nigeria, and so on that owns these resources. When we say fossil fuels have to stay in the ground in order not to get to that wet bulb 35 temperature and cause a mass extinction event, certain governments are looking down the barrel of a gun of financial catastrophe with no way out unless they get compensated for keeping it in the ground. And we're not even good at paying for real goods and services from the developing world. We're not good at helping other countries that are in trouble. And I mean we, the whole developed world. I saw this in Glasgow. People were so tight-fisted, and the developed world isn't even paying what they said they were going to in previous COP agreements. 100 billion, and they had only paid out 20 billion. One guy from Jordan said to me, you know what, the sewage budget for New York City is $35 billion a year. And here we're given $20 billion to mitigate climate change all over the entire earth. You got to be kidding me. So for the petrostates, looking at the loss of a huge portion of their national income, which funds everything, government services like Social Security or police, roads, airport controllers, and so on and so forth. It goes on and on. What are they going to do? And so I think that Putin is flailing here, trying to distract people, trying to become self-sufficient, trying to trying to get out of the gun sights of the coming situation. And it's not a great rational move, because immediately the Germans and the whole European Union is going to try to wean themselves from Russian natural gas as quick as they can. But I feel that this sense of desperation, as it becomes more general, our attempts to deal with climate change as an international group of sovereign nations is going to founder on things like what happened on Thursday, more and more discord. We got to come to a financial accommodation that everybody believes in. So this is, and God, Georgia, let's not talk about me having to write this book. I think we have to live this book. We don't need another science fiction novel.
Okay, I won't push. But we need someone to write it up. You know, it's like we need these, I don't know what you call them, truths, but we need something like a list of things that we need to know has to happen. You know, that list of what has to happen in order for us to survive on this planet.
Yes.
That list needs to be done. And it may not have to be in a science fiction book, but we need the list.
Yes, there are some good lists out there, but they need to have more penetration into the culture at large, for sure.
Okay, well, that will be another process. What I'd like to do now is go to questions from the audience. And I see Matt has had his hand up for a while, and I know he's read the book. So Matt, I am calling on you.
Just a quick question. I found the opening of the book just gripping about the heat wave in India and wet bulb 35. I remember learning about wet bulb temperature in meteorology in college. That's like, I just looked it up, it's about 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And what humidity is wet bulb 35?
At 95, you need to have humidity of, if I recall correctly, and don't quote me on this because you can probably even look it up. Yeah. It was high, but not that high. It was like maybe a 70% humidity, something like that. And of course, the hotter it gets, it tends to wring out the air a little bit. So this is an unusual combination, high heat and high humidity in combination. But the American South, the Midwest, there are vast regions of the earth where these combinations do happen.
India is one of them.
Yeah.
Richard, Dale?
It's actually me, Lynn. So Richard and I have been working on environment stuff in Sonoma at the Sonoma Ecology Center for a long time. I'm on my second time reading the book. Love it. Our 14-year-old liked it too.
Oh, good.
I was just really interested in how all the different dynamics changes, tipping points that are talked about in the book could apply in California or in, Central California, where you live and where we live. And it's funny that you said that you don't like to get into group psychology, because it seems to me like the whole book is about group psychology. Like, what does it take for different groups to take action? And, in the 2017 fires that happened to Sonoma County, that still wasn't enough to change land use rules, for example, that could have made so much good difference. And so I'm just wondering if you have any examples or ideas about how change can happen in California, because California is a big podium, a big place where change can have ripple effects throughout the world.
Well, thank you for that. And of course, as Californians, we're looking at a place, powerful, beautiful, crowded, spectacular in multiple ways, historically and naturally. And I've been seeing so many good things, and you see the California chapters in Ministry for the Future are ways of celebrating what's going on here already. Point to the restoration of the oak forests around the foothills surrounding the Central Valley. I recently met with Jennifer Norris, who's head of the California 30 by 30 program, 30% of California protected by the year 2030. She tells me that we're already at 24%, that we're going to make 30%. And what I realized talking with Norris was this: a framework in which to imagine that your little part of the puzzle is one jigsaw piece in a larger jigsaw, and that you don't have to stress that your piece isn't going to be the total solution. It's just your piece, and it will fit into a bigger effort. Like bricks in a wall. The wall is beyond you, but your brick is not beyond you. So people are really encouraged by 30-30, and people Californians are really encouraged by California. Progressive government. I mean, California cannot solve global problems by itself, but it can be an exemplary figure. It can show what the solutions would look like elsewhere, and it's already doing that. So we a big support and push for what's already going on here all across the board is great. And what I wanted to mention about that 30 by 30 is that people doing little things right down to their backyard, but all the way up to various kinds of organizations saving something in their biome, when they know they're part of the 30 by 30 thing, and everybody's thinking, and then 50 by 50, then it's encouraging for their effort, and it changes in terms of group psychology. It changes the structure of feeling. Everybody's in solidarity. They got their shoulder to their part of the wheel. The wheel's beginning to move. So there's something, and I think to end, that Ministry became popular as a novel in the same kind of a way, in that it showed the whole wall stretching out into the future. So we build the bricks. There's going to be collapses. There's going to be people trying to knock the wall down, but there's not very many stories of the parts adding up to a whole that gets us to a good place. There was a real hunger for that story, and the flaws in my novel, which have become obvious to me in the aftermath, they're not important compared to the importance of that story. So it's all good.
Great. Ray, you're next.
Unmuting. Yes, I just wanted to first let everybody know that currency image came from my twisted mind to as a piece of art for our 2012 National Biochar Conference. And I call it the Bucky, representing carbon as a concept for a sustainable currency exchange. So since Bucky is directly related to carbon, having discovered the structure of the Buckyball, that's where that sort of flowed from. And I see Richard laughing over there because he was the entity that helped us put it on, and they now run the biochar entity here in Sonoma. So anyway, I wanted to tell everybody about that. The basic concept being, why don't we structure mediums of exchange on things that are actually, both abundant and valued in nature, the exchange of carbon. So, rather than, twisted notion of shiny keys, I guess. So that's that. I wanted to explain that, but then I wanted to ask, you kind of dance around a little bit with geoengineering, and you even mentioned biochar. So what is your concept of that, and how does that fit into the concept of geoengineering?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. That's a good question, because it brings up, what are we talking about when we use this word geoengineering? And okay, we've got too much CO2 in the atmosphere. We've got to draw it down. It's quite possible that we won't get back to a truly healthy state unless we draw down back to 350 parts per million, like the group 350.org seems to be suggesting by their title. And that's going to require carbon drawdown that every single form of it, which includes biochar, is going to need to be employed as part of it. And then we can test out which works best. And also some of the methods begin to max out, like returning carbon to agricultural soil. There's a huge capacity there, but once you've filled it, you've topped it out. And kelp beds, they only exist in certain parts of the coastal waters. If you had healthy kelp beds everywhere, you can't put them in the deep ocean, et cetera. You can't put them on land. So all of the methods, and including direct air capture, which is machinery built specifically to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere, expensive. And of course, you're using a lot of industrial materials to make those things work. On the other hand, it's an overriding imperative that we get CO2 out of the atmosphere. So all these things matter, and growing forests. No one of them can take down the gigatons we need to take down, and especially not fast enough. So it's an all hands on deck situation. And biochar is proven, and it does the job. So it's a big part of the mix. Yeah, I would make. This is something that I've been enjoying as the last year and a half of talks like this, and going to Glasgow for COP26. Now I can say to you all, the global carbon reward. You look it up. Delton Chen, who wrote the paper that I read, is on part of a group now that has Californians backing it and organizing him. So he's become the kind of theorist or emeritus theorist. The activation of a global carbon reward is in that organization's name. So if you Google global carbon reward, you'll begin to see a program that is making inroads again with the central banks, and we're trying to, I'm just an advisor to them, or I would connect them up with you. In fact, I've sent him your Bucky, the image, and they were loving it. So this is the kind of thing I can do now.
Well,
But
have him get in touch. I'd love to talk more. Yeah.
yeah, I'll see what they. I'll do that. I'll send across if you through this organization, I can get your contact info. They may already
Yes.
have it because it. I'm not sure. I must have seen it from Georgia and gotten
Yes,
it to
I
you.
sent it to you.
Yeah. So I just passed it along, and they were amused. They might have their own ideas for some other image, obviously, but there's room for multiple ways to draw carbones or whatever.
Carbones.
Yeah. So yeah, it's an ongoing process.
Just one part of that question that wasn't clearly answered, and you don't need to spend much time on it, but geoengineering.
Oh yes. Well, that word is now too big and too various and too loaded. There are a lot of environmentalists and leftists. So in other words, a lot of my gang, because I am both a leftist and an environmentalist, have a knee-jerk reaction that comes out of like 1990. That geoengineering is the silicone tech heads trying to silver bullet their way out of burning carbon, and then they'll just burn more carbon and try to get away with it. This is talking about solar radiation management typically, which is to say throwing dust into the atmosphere. Well, all of that is old hat now, and we're in a new world where if we start hitting wet bulb 35 temperatures, and we're clearly in a mass extinction event, if the oceans start dying, we're going to have to do things on purpose. The Sir David King, Sir Dave as they call him, is at Cambridge University now, but he was the environmental minister for Blair and Brown in the UK Labour governments or turn of the century. The UK's fairly good environmental policies come out of this guy, and now he's working at Cambridge to do a climate group, of course. He says, oh, well, the geoengineering we like now is there's not enough whale poop anymore in the ocean because there's only 1% of the whales that there were 150 or 200 years ago. And it turns out that whales eat low and poop high in the water. And so you don't put iron filings in the ocean and hope for a bloom. You imitate what whales used to produce and you bring the oceans back to health. Is that geoengineering, concocting artificial whale poop and dropping it in the ocean? Well, yes, it is. And then another thing he said was you put fine particles of salt water so that there's crystals of salt in it, really fine particles, micrometer sized, right above the cloud layer, not high in the stratosphere, but just high in the cloud layer. It whitens the clouds and it thickens the clouds. And you need to do that over the Arctic Ocean so that the Arctic Ocean ice doesn't melt. He says, oh, you need 700 autonomous vehicles. They could be crewed, I think. I don't see why not, but wandering around the watery parts of the Arctic Ocean, shooting a fine spray above the cloud layer. Is that geoengineering? Well, yes, it is. And then lastly, women's rights, women's legal rights, women's education, wherever that's high, human reproduction is low, and fewer humans would help. So that once you get to justice as a geoengineering technique, at that point, you've blown up the term adequately to make people put it aside and rethink everything for what it is, what it's specifically proposing, and not just say, oh, geoengineering, that's bad, which is, I hear that all too often, even now.
Okay, we don't have time for too many more questions, but I'm going to go to Betsy. It looks like you're next.
Thank you. Hello and good afternoon. I'm a fan of yours from New York 2140. where you not only do you have an older woman as the major character, but it's all set in co-ops, New York City co-ops, which are a much bigger scale than we have here in California. But I wanted to salute that, and I wanted to also say I recommend the book. I'm halfway through Ministry of the Future and have not gotten to the part about the Mondragon co-ops, which are often highly romanticized. My question, it's not really a question, it's actually just saluting the way you're bringing together the pieces of, whether it's Bitcoin, which is not happening, but the conversation about alternative currencies, eco-villages, cooperative ways of owning land has all been kind of happening in a parallel universe from my own research and my own personal experience. It's been happening for at least 100 years in the US, and there's reasons why it kind of faded out and is not well known at all. But I do want to say that I had an opportunity with a colleague from Davis. Someone called me up and said, let's put together a paper on the role that co-ops, environmental commons, based on the Nobel Prize winning researcher, Eleanor Ostrom, and this kind of co-housing intentional community world. Let's talk to the IPP, which I guess is the people documenting the climate model, and have them include those socioeconomic institutional structures as a factor in how well a particular region can actually adapt and respond to the feedback of environmental trauma. So I just wanted to add that. I'm very excited to see reality and science fiction beginning to merge up. And thank you. Thank you for, as well, Georgia, for putting this together.
Thank you. Any
Well,
comments?
yeah, thank you for that. And I want to say that New York 2140 is my attempt to deal with all these things in a slightly different scenario. The year 2140 is far enough out there that massive changes have happened, except for New York is still New York. And I had a lot of fun with that one. That one is a comedy of coping. Ministry for the Future is more stressed and desperate. It's a different kind of novel. And I of course, I did my best in both, but I have a fondness for the New York novel because I like New York when I visit it. And I live in Village Homes Davis, which is a co-op of sorts. And I'm currently embroiled in a battle here that is the nano version of the macro. And so I appreciate your comments, because these novels don't go away. And the New York novel is to me, a less stressed and more joyful experience, which, considering that it is a climate catastrophe novel, is a strange thing to say, but you have to take different approaches in each book to try to come at different angles of how things might feel.
I'm actually going to go to Michael next. Michael?
Hello, Georgia, thanks for hosting this, and Mr. Robinson, huge fan. I'm here as a fan, but I'm also here representing the local weekly paper, and I'm going to be writing a little bit about what's been brought up in this talk. And I guess as an activist looking at what's possible in climate myself, I'm looking for the lever points, right? And one thing that's come up quite a bit in my journalistic exploration is the legal framework around moral injury. And you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, talking about young people, a little bit about psychology and legal action. So I'm wondering if that's something you're familiar with and could talk about, because, you know, like how do we get organizations and governments to take action? And perhaps there is a legal framework. I'm not sure. I'm convinced, but it has definitely come up in a number of recent articles I've written and interviews I've done. So there's a question in there. Do you know about moral injury, and is this maybe one of the better levers we have for us?
Well, it's certainly one. And I know that there are movements like the Children's Trust and various kinds of legal groups saying that the rights of children are being abrogated and broken by continuing to burn carbon. These cases are having trouble getting traction, and it's partly a matter of standing. You need to have legal standing. And this is particularly problematic when the people that you're trying to litigate on the behalf of are trees, are wild animals. They're citizens, but they don't have standing yet. So it's a problem. I think I don't think it's the strongest leverage point that there is, but we need them all. And what would be stronger, turns to my mind, is getting a working political majority to change the laws, to have sharply progressive taxation, and to have progressive corporate taxation and permanent asset progressive taxes. That would do more to break up monopoly than anything else. If the bigger the company, the bigger your tax rate, all those companies would devolve and try to break up into smaller units to avoid the tax rates. And that would, if they broke up in a real sense, antitrust law being pushed against them, then we might have fewer of these giant companies. On the other hand, the big asset managers with their hundreds of trillions that they can throw around, if they throw them around greenly, then good things result from that. So being persuasive, which is the art of rhetoric, we need to study rhetoric in the ancient Greek sense of a taxonomy of arguments of persuasion that is quite sophisticated, and bring it to bear every single argument. And I think that for sure, these cases coming into the courts from the young are one way to go. But I think there are other ways. They all should be employed. That's what it comes down to.
Very good point that you just brought up about the art of good arguing.
Yeah.
We don't learn that unless you study that specifically. We don't.
I would just like to say quickly, Howard, I see your hand, and also if you want to raise your hand, you can click the reactions button and then the raise hands.
Can I quickly make one short response about argumentation?
Because that's what we have to.
Absolutely. What I've learned in studying argumentation in my degree in philosophy and in practicing it out in the world is argumentation is not super effective ultimately, but demonstration is very effective. So just leaving that thought out there.
Yep, that could be a long conversation.
No, but that's a good thought.
Please, please. I'll take that conversation.
Great. Okay. Well, we'll have that sometime, Michael. Marianne, I want to go to you next, but I noticed a lot of movement in your picture. So are you?
Yeah, I'll stand still. I'll just stand still. I'm in Portland, and it's cold today, and it was 115 or 117 this summer. So we're experiencing some extreme weather, and really appreciated your book, because I think it helps you kind of picture the future. And in the sustainability and climate work I do, people tend to be having conversations as if life will continue the way it is now, and not that there's 20 years worth of carbon built up whose consequence we haven't seen yet. So we know over the next decades there'll be lots more bad things happening, and I feel like people are just sort of operating as if it's always going to be the same, as if conditions are always going to be the same as they are now. So I appreciate your book for helping visualize what things are as they get worse, and also how people can pull together to take action. And I really appreciated your puzzle analogy, because there's a project I want to work on that's just very local to me. And it's encouraging to think if I do a really good job with that and create a model other people can emulate, that that could make a difference and not feel so helpless in face of these enormous challenges that we face as a species and as part of the living system of the earth.
I would like to take, do you want to make any comments, Dan, before I take a last question?
Well, thank you for that. Yes, we all have our part to play in that. And if it adds up, then we've got solidarity and things might work. Yes.
Great. John, I noticed that you wanted to ask something. Can you make it brief?
Yeah, briefly. So I noticed you touch on a lot of the pain points for Bitcoin, mainly being the proof of work and the power consumption there. Cards on the table, I do believe crypto has value to leftist goals, generally in the points of reducing central points of information's verity, and also just reducing points of censorship. So I just wanted to know, do you see any value in open sourcing digital infrastructure? Is it problems with the currency aspect? Because the way leftists see it, the label cryptocurrency has done us a lot of harm. A better term is distributed ledgers and distributed ledger technology, which gets better across that it's really just about information verity and distributing infrastructure. So I just was wondering if you see any good ideas in the philosophical open sourcing digital infrastructure space, or if it's all that speculative angle that you note, which I agree with, because it's an open space. You're going to have those type of people. We don't disregard anyone, so it's hard to get good representatives when you don't turn anyone away.
Well, it's an interesting question, because it comes down to a certain extent, it comes down to the language being used to describe these things. I mean, I believe in open source in the same way that I believe in open science, that things should be public and not privatized for private profit. Genetically modified organisms, if it was a public thing that was being shared by everybody, then the objections to it might not be as strong. The objections seem to me not to be about physics, but about economics, that it's privatizing the genome, and so people hate it. Crypto is the same kind of problem. The name is probably bad. The uses of it have been bad. I have many leftist friends who are even working on the Economic Space Agency, for instance. The ESA is working on trying to work up a digital currency that could be used to mark social goods, and also sometimes to represent animals. And believe me, the plans that I've heard they sound great, but I don't understand them at the fundamental basis of everybody is under the table and at the bottom of their thoughts is still thinking, can that turn into US dollars? So, and distributed ledgers, especially of the blockchain variety, that was invented at the National Security Agency. So the weirdness of using state instrumentation and technologies in order to create supposedly distributed systems, ultimately I begin to think I'm a statist. We are in climate change. We got an awkward system, but it is the system that we're in, and we can't change it fast enough, and we don't know what those changes will bring anyway. We've got to bring the state into a being. We've got to bring capitalism into line with the biosphere survival. And to the extent that digital currencies help that, I'm all for them. But I really talking to the wrong person here, because I'm an English major. Hey, I wanted to say I have to go pretty damn soon, but I wanted to say to everybody, I see 44 comments in the chat, and to the extent that those are questions, I told Georgia this before, I am happy to get these saved and sent to me as an email file, because I'll lose them when this Zoom goes away. And I will answer them all. I appreciate people asking and doing comments, want to keep the conversation going. And I figure that you've taken the trouble to write them down. I'll take the trouble to write a quick response, very quick response, but I do it as a kind of velocity exercise in the evenings, and I quite enjoy it. And then Georgia can get the answers back out to you.
The only last question I'd like to do, Stan, is I see Bruce Franklin, who's also a science fiction writer.
Bruce Franklin?
Yes.
Howard had his up for a while. I don't know if
Howard, is it?
Yes,
Yeah.
That's true.
Howard Franklin, had his up for a minute.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
My bad. Sorry.
Aren't you Bruce?
You're gonna have to unmute whoever has Howard Franklin as the Skype name, not Skype name.
There he is.
Okay.
So, hey man, I'm online here. I can't.
Okay, so
text me. Well, 512.
okay.
Yes.
This is a great book. It's a book we really need. But you have all kinds of good things that you propose, like the ministry itself, for doing the with the devices, the carbon coin, but you also throw in tally. So do we need all of these things to happen, or just some of these things to happen? And do we need to have actual violent, like the drones that knocked out the airplanes? Do we
Yep.
need, is that part of the solution that is necessary to fight these guys?
Well, I don't know. Bruce, are you out there in New Jersey? Is it my Bruce?
No, I mean, California.
Did you retire and come back?
Yes. he did.
Yeah, right.
We'll
We
have
should
to get
all
together.
of you together.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have too much time, but it's good to see you. And of course, your question is, as always, to the point. I worry about this badly, and ministry, again, is not a good guide to action, or even a guide to thought, because it doesn't do enough on sabotage, the wrecking of property that doesn't hurt humans, as opposed to murder. And the book makes a very murky case for distinguishing these and destranding these forms of resistance. So I hadn't read Andreas Malm, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. I hadn't talked things over in great detail with Bill McKibben, as I have since. And so if I were to write ministry again, I might add a few chapters to try to clarify that. But one thing I think I did do was I presented how messy the future is going to be. And it doesn't matter what I think as a suburban white man, house husband, very privileged, very safe, and very nonviolent. Who cares? In this world, if there are bad enough disasters and there's enough injustice, the children of Kali are going to be out there. They're going to be mad, and they're going to want not just justice, but vengeance. And I think that's, the ministry presents that realistically enough that one thing I think ministry might be suggesting is that that kind of violence might be effective or needed. That I'm not so sure about. It might be just an excuse for a police state and more death and destruction and chaos. So I worry about that aspect of the book very much. And I only can say that there's a larger discussion going on there. Erica Chenoweth, Why Civil Resistance Works, Bill McKibben, and a close study of LBJ's interactions with Martin Luther King. These are super interesting. And Andreas Malm, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. These are who you need to talk to read and interact with, to contextualize Ministry for the Future, which is just a case study. One future could be very messy, and that one I described. And maybe we could do it without the mess, one would hope, by telling the story first. This Jordanian I talked with at COP26 was a most impressive man, Zaid al-Raid Hussein. And he said to me, you don't have to be in a plane crash to know that they would be bad, to know that you don't want to be in one. So this power of the story or of the example or of dodging catastrophe, that maybe we don't need the children of Kali, maybe we only need to have the idea, and it would be enough to make us change. But this is maybe a little bit liberal, wimpy, suburban house husband talking. So I am in a state of complete confusion. And truly, Bruce, you know more about this than I do, and I hope you're writing about these issues.
He's a real activist. Well, I want to thank you, Stan, so much for being with us today, answering our questions, and just all of your brilliance that we've been able to take in. I appreciate it so much. And hopefully we can have you live sometime here in Sonoma as well.
That would be a pleasure. Do send out my questions to me, the unanswered questions to me, and I'll answer back.
I will send them to you. I am going to stop the recording right now.
Okay.